A global catastrophe began in the world, during which the temperature on Earth became unsuitable for life. 95% of all residents died in the first minutes after the start of the disaster, while the survivors tried to do everything not to die. From the lack of food resources, people began to lose their minds, and many began to create their own colonies in which people killed and robbed anyone who caught their eye, after which they ate them. Zhang Yi was one of the few who managed not to die at the beginning of the disaster, but a few days later he died because of his naivety, after which one of the colonies stole his supplies and ate his remains. Later, Zhang wakes up in his apartment unharmed before the great catastrophe begins. Then Zhang learns that, apparently, he is reborn at a point in time when there was about a month left before the start of the disaster. The cause of this global cataclysm was the fall of a meteorite, due to which the temperature on Earth ranged from -60 to -70 degrees Celsius. Zhang thought that now he should ensure his own safety and stock up on supplies as quickly as possible, after which he wanted to take revenge on those bandits who killed him. Zhang also did not forget that in addition to protection and provisions, he must take care of weapons in order to be able to repulse those people if they want to break into him. Zhang immediately finds himself in a different dimension, which he wanted to equip as a warehouse with various resources. Zhang thought that if he could transfer all his supplies to this dimension, he could easily survive decades in such harsh conditions. After that, Zhang thought that during the global apocalypse, he would no longer be able to enjoy various goodies, and the first thing he decides to eat his favorite food is the first thing. Zhang then went to one of the most elite restaurants in Tianhai, where he ordered a bunch of different food worth several tens of thousands of yuan. Zhang devoured everything that was brought to him with a wild appetite, thinking about how people prayed for some noodles during the disaster. Zhang left the restaurant a few hours later, and the waiter offered him a VIP customer card, but Zhang refused such a gift from the establishment. At that moment, Zhang's girlfriends were passing by, who accidentally noticed him and thought that Zhang was not as poor as they had imagined him before. When these girlfriends decided to greet Zhang, he saw Yuqin, the same girlfriend, because of whom he was killed that time. However, Zhang didn't point it out and told his girlfriends that he was on his way to the store to buy some things. Then the girlfriends said that they were also going to buy a few things, and then they decide to go to the store together. Upon entering one of the nearby shops, the friends were surprised that Zhang began to buy almost all the products in the store. Zhang, on the other hand, said that various things can happen in life, and that you need to be prepared for anything, for example, for a global ice age. The girlfriends did not take Zhang's thoughts seriously and offered him to treat them to dinner for their help, to which Zhang suggested that they have a joint dinner next month, since now he had a lot of urgent business. Yuqin's friend couldn't contain her emotions and said that Zhang goes to the store and buys so many products on her own. Yuqin, on the other hand, told Zhang that her friend was just tired, and she asked him not to take her words seriously. That friend then started apologizing to Zhang and telling him that he was a very good person. After a couple of hours, Zhang and her girlfriends were about to leave the store with carts that were filled to the brim with various foods. Zhang noticed the incomprehensible glances of passers-by, but this did not bother him at all, since he was only haunted by the thought of surviving and avenging his death. At that moment, Auntie Lin with her little grandson passed by Zhang, who was surprised by the large amount of food Zhang bought. Auntie Lin was both surprised and terrified that Zhang could easily leave people without food, while her grandson tried to steal chocolate from Zhang's cart without being noticed. Zhang noticed how a chocolate bar was almost stolen from him, and he immediately takes it away from the child. Then the kid started yelling at Zhang and threatening him that he would kill him if he didn't give the chocolate. The words of the petty thief did not frighten Zhang in any way, and in response he threatened the child. Then the baby in tears clung to Aunt Lin, who began to criticize Zhang for trying to educate her grandson. After that, Auntie Lin said that she was going to buy a chocolate from Zhang, while telling her that she would bring the money to him later. Instead of handing over the chocolate, Zhang held out the phone in front of her and told her that she was either paying for the chocolate right now, or she was going to the store and buying the chocolate herself. Then Auntie Lin became even more angry and began to threaten Zhang that he would pay for his greed, but Zhang himself did not pay any attention to her. After a while, Zhang was already at home with all his purchases, and Yuqin kept reminding him to invite Zhang to visit them. After that, Zhang decides to see how some of the food will be stored in his dimension, after which he was going to look for medicines. Also, Zhang did not forget that he needed to get firearms as soon as possible, since it would be very difficult to get them now, while getting melee weapons and bow and arrows was not difficult. The next day, Zhang decides to check what happened to the food he left behind in his dimension. Zhang noticed that the meat and vegetables were fine, while the fish was spoiled, since time passes differently in his dimension, and then Zhang decides to do the same experiment with already prepared foods. After that, Zhang called on the phone and said that he was organizing a big party for his friends. The receptionist then picked up the phone and told Zhang that his order would cost at least 1 million yuan and that he would have to make an advance payment of 200,000 yuan. Zhang transferred the amount of the deposit and after that he went to leave his house on bail. After mortgaging his house, Zhang received 6 million yuan in his account and began counting further expenses for housing renovations, medicine, and weapons, from which he concludes that he does not have enough money for all expenses. At that moment, Zhang was approached by a person who wanted to offer Zhang to use the services of the company where he works. Zhang was pleased that he found a way for himself to get a large sum of money so quickly. After some time, this man brought Zhang to his boss to discuss all the conditions for issuing money to Zhang. The director began to ask Zhang how much and for how long he wants to receive from him. Zhang said that he needed to get as much money as possible as soon as possible, and that he would return all the money within 3 months, regardless of the interest rate. Before signing the contract, the director asked Zhang for something as collateral. Zhang offered to take his house and his expensive car as collateral, totaling more than 5 million yuan, and then the director began to doubt that Zhang could return all the money in time. Then Zhang tried to persuade the director to at least slightly reduce the total loan amount to at least 4 million, on the condition that he return the whole 7 million yuan to him. The director accepts such conditions and Zhang signs the agreement, after which he left the office. Zhang was pleased that the director actually gave him these 4 million, since he was sure that in less than a month these people would immediately die after the start of the disaster, and he would not have to return this money. After that, Zhang decided to go to the office of one of the largest security companies, Zhanlong, which provides high-class protection to various celebrities and politicians. Zhang was approached by Huai Ren, the manager of the commercial department of the security company. Huai greeted Zhang, and Zhang immediately asked him to create a shelter that would be able to withstand any consequences of the end of the world. Huai told Zhang that their company could do whatever it took to create such a hideout, whereupon he provided Zhang with some blueprints for different variations of the hideouts. The blueprints for the shelter included very thick steel walls, bulletproof glass, a high-tech ventilation system, an advanced video surveillance system, and armored doors. As Zhang looked over the schemes of the shelter, he thought that the most important thing for him was to make a large metal box out of his house that would withstand extremely low temperatures and no one could seep through. Huai also added that their company is able to create a shelter almost anywhere, regardless of the size and location of the house. In the meantime, Huai also told Zhang that before he became a manager in this company, he was an international mercenary, and therefore he himself knows a lot about such shelters. These words are very interested in Zhang, and he decides to ask the manager if he can get a firearm for him. Huai said that he couldn't resolve the issue right away, to which Zhang said that the other day he accidentally ran into several guys who were carrying machine guns. Huai said that he had some connections with people who could provide him with weapons, but he was also worried that he could not easily provide weapons to a stranger. Huai told Zhang that the construction of the shelter should take up to 2 weeks, during which time he would try to resolve the issue of obtaining weapons for Zhang, for which Zhang was very grateful. Next, Zhang was going to start acquiring melee weapons, such as an axe, clubs, and so on. After some time, Zhang went to a hunting shop for a crossbow and arrows for him. Luckily for Zhang, he had a hunting license, which gave him peace of mind if someone suddenly found his crossbow. About an hour later, Zhang arrived home, where several food trucks and a bewildered crowd of residents were already stacked. Zhang approached the uncle, who did not miss the delivery, and told him that he ordered such a large delivery and that these trucks could go further. Meanwhile, the neighbors were discussing how much Zhang could spend on such a large order. Among the neighbors present, Yuqin was also thinking that Zhang really did have so much money and that she shouldn't embarrass herself in front of him. Zhang, of course, noticed Yuqin among the crowd, but he pretended not to notice her, and thought that he would send her to the next world at the first opportunity. A few minutes later, Zhang was confronted with a pile of boxes of various culinary delicacies from the hotel. Looking at these boxes, Zhang did not stop thinking that all these sweets now belong to him, and that he can enjoy them for the rest of his days, after which he immediately began to move these boxes to his dimension. The next day, builders and engineers from the security company came to Zhang's home to refurbish Zhang's entire apartment into an impenetrable fortress. In the meantime, Zhang's neighbors began to suspect that he had become somehow crazy, since he began to buy large quantities of food and make an impenetrable fortress out of his house. At that moment, Huai's manager wrote to Zhang, who wanted to inform him that an acquaintance of his would give Zhang a firearm within 3 days. After the correspondence, he informs the employees of the security company that during the construction period he will move to live in a hotel room. Later, Zhang went to the warehouse of an acquaintance who was a warehouse manager to ask him to collect all the contents of the warehouse for double the price and get himself a little vacation. Once in the warehouse, Zhang realized that he would have enough of those products, tools and other things that would be useful to him at the time of the disaster. At the warehouse, Zhang noticed that Zhou Peng, one of the warehouse workers, was about to invite Yuqin to a concert this weekend, to which she replied that she had a date scheduled for that weekend. At this moment, Zhou Peng noticed Zhang and began to blame him for Yuqin's back pain because of their shopping yesterday. Yuqin interrupted Zhou Peng and said that she did not have any pain, and that she just had a little tingling in her lower back. Then Zhang realized that Yuqin had already told everyone everything yesterday. Zhou Peng did not stop blaming Zhang and demanded that Zhang give Yuqin 500 yuan for a doctor as compensation. Zhang told Zhou Peng that Yuqin herself decided to help him, and that Zhou Peng had no right to tell him. Zhou Peng was very frightened by Zhang's behavior and advised Yuqin to stay as far away from Zhang as possible. Yuqin was also frightened by how much Zhang had changed in recent days. On the same day, Yuqin decides to write to Zhang and personally find out from him what happened to him, that he has changed so much in such a short period of time. Yuqin was very annoyed that she decided to write to Zhang first, while he was blatantly ignoring her messages. Then Yuqin decides to ask her friend what she personally thinks about such changes in Zhang. The friend says that Zhang is just crazy and that Yuqin should not dwell on it. About a week later, Zhang received his shipment of firearms, with which he can fight back anyone who even tries to break into his house. A little later, Zhang also received a large package with various medicines and first aid items. After that, Zhang said that he needed to order some more things, and he asked the courier to help him with this. The courier agrees to help, at which point Zhang receives a message from the manager of the security company, saying that the conversion of Zhang's house into a shelter has already been completed. A few minutes later, Zhang was already in his apartment, in which all the walls were sheathed with a thick layer of hardened steel. Manager Huai also told how his workers introduced an advanced ventilation system into the apartment and improved the thermal insulation system. They also installed armored bulletproof glass in all the windows in the house, which was even stronger than all the steel cladding in the house. In addition, the workers provided the entire building with a video surveillance system of 300 cameras, with which you can monitor all floors at once. Zhang thanked the manager and his company for such a good result. When Huai's manager left the apartment, Zhang wished that the manager would not be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the bunker when the world ended. Meanwhile, Zhang finally received the last order in the form of a whole truckload of clean water, because during the apocalypse it will be the hardest to get. Uncle Yu, who was very kind to Zhang, decided to ask him why exactly Zhang ordered so much water. Zhang told Uncle Yu to prepare food and water supplies as soon as possible before they become too expensive, as very low temperatures are predicted in winter. During the conversation, Uncle Yu's boss intervened, who assured him that Zhang could not be trusted under any circumstances. Uncle Yu said that his boss just got a little excited and asked him not to hold a grudge against him. In the remaining days, Zhang decided not to waste money, and he spent all his money to the last yuan in places such as various bars and restaurants. Zhang also did not stop buying mountains of food in stores for his warehouse. Zhang also learned how to shoot weapons and went to the gym so that during a disaster no one would have a chance to resist him. 3 days before the disaster, Zhang comes to work early so that no one suspects him of missing a large part of all the things in the warehouse, and adds sleeping pills to his colleagues' tea. After a couple of minutes, Zhang returns to his colleagues and invites them all to relax together and drink a mug of tea. All the workers, without exception, decided that they really could do with a little rest, and they all sit down together to drink tea. Half an hour later, all the employees of the warehouse fell asleep soundly, and then Zhang decides to take on the theft of things from the warehouse. Before picking up everything from the warehouse, Zhang disables the entire security system and all security cameras so as not to create a lot of noise around him. After that, Zhang began to move all the boxes in the warehouse to his dimension in a matter of seconds. Zhang collected absolutely everything from the warehouse to his dimension: gasoline, toys, food, household items and much more. After a few minutes, Zhang moved almost all the things into his dimension, leaving one small batch of goods in the corner. Zhang decided to look at the contents of the boxes, and they found sets of clothes that can withstand extremely low temperatures, which can be very useful in the conditions of the end of the world. After that, there was not a single box left in the warehouse that Zhang would not take to his dimension. Later, Zhang returns to his sleeping colleagues and knocks out sleeping pills so that no one will think that it was Zhang who stole all the things in the warehouse. After a couple of hours, colleagues started waking up Zhang to inform him that someone had stolen all the things from the warehouse. Once at the warehouse, Zhang pretended to be very shocked at how someone completely robbed their warehouse in such a time. Then one of the employees approached Zhang with a phone in his hands, through which the director called Zhang. Zhang picked up the phone and heard the director's voice, who wanted to find out what was going on in their warehouse. Zhang said that they still don't know how it all happened, and he said that in the last 2 hours, all the things were missing from the warehouse. From what he heard, the director's voice became even angrier, and he began to blame Zhang for everything that was happening. Then Zhang tried to convince the director that he could not empty the entire warehouse alone in these 2 hours. Zhang also added that they will not be able to find out the reason for the loss of such a quantity of goods on their own, and that they need to contact the relevant authorities to investigate and sort everything out. The director agreed with Zhang's suggestion and said that he would contact the general director to get in touch with the right people to investigate. After the call, Zhang told his colleagues not to worry about what was happening and that the director would send experts to investigate. Zhang then told the staff that everything would be fine if they cooperated with the investigation and that it was not their fault that they all fell asleep at work at once. One of the representatives of the investigating commission told Zhang that if he learns any details about this, he should report it to them. Another representative of the investigation commission asked Zhang not to leave the city until the end of the investigation, but Zhang was not going to leave anyway. As Zhang walked down the street to his house, he saw news on the big screen on the building, which talked about a case of theft of a large consignment of goods in one of the city's warehouses. That world ice age remained 2 days, but now there was a sharp drop in temperature outside. People on the street in a panic began to urgently return to their homes so as not to freeze. Zhang also did not linger on the street for too long and decides to return home, never ceasing to think that in a couple of days the world familiar to everyone will cease to exist. After 2 days, due to the explosion of the sun, the temperature on Earth began to drop sharply, thereby causing a real ice age on Earth. Panic overtook people, and no one wanted to leave their homes, so as not to accidentally freeze on the street. Zhang watched everything that was happening on the street now and understood that the time of the great extinction of mankind had come. Zhang sat at home and read the messages of his friends, who never ceased to be surprised by such weather. Zhang understood that snow would fall continuously for at least 3 months, which would cause the temperature to drop even more. The very next morning there was so much snow on the street that people could not leave their houses, as the snow completely blocked the doors. Even in their homes, people continued to freeze, and no one knew what to do about it, since few people had warm clothes. Meanwhile, Zhang was sleeping peacefully in his bed, and the problem of global cooling did not bother him at all. Suddenly, someone decided to call Zhang in the middle of the night, and it turned out to be Yuqin. Yuqin was going to ask Zhang if he had known about the beginning of the global cataclysm before that day. Zhang said that he just happened to hear about it one day from a friend of his. Then Yuqin decided to ask Zhang why he had not warned her about the beginning of the disaster. Zhang decides to end the call and hang up, which frightens Yuqin very much. Yuqin felt that Zhang had gone mad and that she urgently needed to do something. Zhang decides to ignore Yuqin and goes to watch the news at breakfast. Zhang eats a medium-rare steak, drinks it down with wine, and watches the news report about a global cooling. According to the news, it was strongly recommended not to leave the house without an urgent need, be sure to dress warmly and in no case believe rumors about a shortage or a sharp rise in the price of goods. Zhang, of course, did not believe that the snowfall would soon end, since everything was happening exactly the same as last time. During the meal, Yuqin writes to Zhang asking him to give her some food, while promising that she will return all the food costs to him. Zhang only chuckled at Yuqin's naivety, who thought that he would just give her some of his supplies. Instead, Zhang decides to tease Yuqin and send her a photo of his steak and wine. Yuqin was shocked that while she was starving, Zhang had enough conscience to send her such a photo. Angered, Yuqin wanted to send an insulting message to Zhang, but at one point she thought that she should not allow Zhang to completely stop communicating with her. After chatting with Yuqin, Zhang decides to look through the video surveillance system to see what the current situation is in the building. Through the cameras, Zhang saw Auntie Lin trying to convince the residents not to leave the building until the snowfall ended before leaving the building. Auntie Lin assured people that the snowfall would be over in 2 to 3 days and that they didn't need to go shopping for supplies. People tried to get through saying that no one knew exactly when the snowfall would end, and that if they didn't have enough time to prepare supplies, the prices of goods would go up a lot. Auntie Lin continued to discourage people from going to the shops for fear of shortages and growth in goods. Zhang appeared from the crowd with a warning to Auntie Lin that if the snow continued to fall continuously and people were dying of hunger, then only she would bear the responsibility. People supported Zhang's remarks and tried to ask Auntie Lin what to do next in case everyone starts to run out of supplies. Auntie Lin tried to ease the dissatisfaction of the neighbors by telling them that the blizzard would clear up soon and that no one would run out of supplies. After that, she asked Zhang not to spread panic among people, because, according to her, he violates the law in this way. Zhang returned to his apartment and said that under no circumstances would he go outside. Auntie Lin became very angry with Zhang's behavior and began to think about how she could avenge it. Several days have passed since the beginning of the cataclysm, and Zhang, as if nothing had happened, just sits on the couch, eating various sweets and playing video games. Zhang thought that it was much easier and more enjoyable for him to spend time playing games than to have any kind of relationship with people. At one point, Zhang received a message from Auntie Lin, in which she asked Zhang to remove all the snow from the entrances to the house. Zhang thought that Auntie Lin specifically wrote this request in the general chat, which included all the residents of the building. In response, Zhang wrote that there was no point in going and clearing the snow now, and that it would be better to wait for the snowfall to end. The residents of the house supported Zhang's words, which made Auntie Lin very angry. Then she decides to write in the chat that Zhang wants to turn all the tenants against her, and that such a young and strong young man like Zhang should take the initiative and help his neighbors. She then ordered Zhang, on behalf of the district committee, to go and clear the snow from the street right now. Zhang understood that she was hiding behind her position and was going to turn everyone against him, while the rest of the residents were waiting for the moment when Zhang would turn to rudeness and insults. Then Zhang writes that among the list of people she has chosen for snow removal, there is not a single rich man, hinting to her that she is simply afraid to tell them something. The people then supported Zhang again, citing that when everyone is in danger, Auntie Lin sends only the middle class to do hard work. In the same house lived Zheng Hao and Su Hao, two influential people, and who had their own specific connections and strong influence. Zhang then suggests to Auntie Lin to ask these people to help her clear the snow. It was Zheng Hao who broke down the door to Zhang's apartment with an axe, and Su Hao was the first to stab Zhang with a knife, because of which he died in a past life. Zhang was serious about dealing with these people once and for all. Auntie Lin was very pissed off by Zhang's stubbornness, and she thought that he deliberately cited Zheng Hao and Su Hao as an example so that he himself would not go out. Also, Auntie Lin began to worry that if she gave Zhang some slack, she would no longer be taken seriously. Zheng Hao later noticed a message in the general chat asking Auntie Lin to ask him and Su Hao to go and shovel snow outside. Zheng Hao was angry at this decision, and he decides to tell her everything he thinks about all this in the most aggressive way. Later, Su Hao tells Auntie Lin that he doesn't intend to go outside in this cold, and that he would rather spend the day in bed. On top of that, Su Hao decides to send a video message to the general chat, in which he tells the residents of the house to let the others go to clear the snow. Auntie Lin became even more angry with Zhang for turning such powerful people against her. While Zhang was preparing his own dinner, Auntie Lin called him and told Zhang that he was trying in every possible way to complicate her life and relations with her neighbors. Zhang replied that the whole point of her life is for her to be scolded by someone. Zhang also sternly threatened Auntie Lin that if she didn't leave him alone, she would regret it very much. Auntie Lin was very dissatisfied with this outcome, and she really wanted to give Zhang a lesson for his insubordination. At this time, an enraged Zheng Hao tried to break into Zhang's house, who wanted to talk to him about those messages. Then Zhang stood up from the sofa, took his loaded crossbow and prepared to finish off Zheng Hao. Zhang prepared to fire in case Zheng Hao was able to knock down the door to the apartment. However, Zhang thinks that simply killing Zheng Hao would be too boring, and he decides to taunt him and aim for his leg. Seconds later, Zhang shoots Zheng Hao in the leg through one of the holes in the door. From the incredible pain, Zheng Hao falls to the floor with a shot through his leg, from which blood flows continuously. Zhang thought that with such a low temperature and a deep wound, Zheng Hao would not live long. Meanwhile, Zheng Hao tried his best to get to his apartment to treat his wound. At this moment, the frightened and badly injured Zheng Hao finally made it to the elevator. When the elevator reached the correct floor, Zheng Hao tried to call an ambulance for doctors to help him with his injured leg. However, due to the harsh weather outside, no one answered Zheng Hao, forcing him to give himself first aid on his own. Once at home, Zheng Hao began looking for a first aid kit and trying to get the arrow out of his leg. At one point, Zheng Hao thought that if his leg was icy anyway, then he could just pull out the arrow with his hands. When Zheng Hao finally pulled the arrow out of his leg, he decides to write to Zhang in the general chat that he will deal with him personally, to which Zhang replied that if he tries to break into his apartment again, then next time he will just kill Zheng Hao. Everyone was shocked that Zhang not only fought back Zheng Hao, but also wounded him. After that, Zheng Hao calls his people to inform them that they need to get rid of one kid. A few hours later, a group of armed men came to Zheng Hao's apartment, and Zheng Hao explained to the people that they should get rid of one boy, who wounded him in the leg. A couple of minutes later, guys armed with knives stood near the door to Zhang's apartment and demanded that he leave the apartment. Without waiting for an answer, one of the thugs tried to break through the door to Zhang's apartment with a huge cleaver. However, despite the powerful swing of the weapon, the door was not damaged in any way, and the cleaver itself flew off the door towards one of the thugs, almost killing him. A group of thugs were surprised that such a simple kid had such a strong door. During this time, Zhang played video games and watched as a group of thugs unsuccessfully tried to break into his apartment. At first, Zhang decides to use firearms against them, but after a little thought, he decides to douse these thugs. After a couple of minutes, Zhang sticks a hose out of one hole in the door and starts pouring cold water on the thugs. From such an attack, all the thugs were completely wet, from which they began to fall to the floor and slowly covered with a thin layer of ice. After such a water bombardment, Zhang returned to the sofa and continued to watch the thugs through the cameras. At this time, several thugs were sitting in Zhang Hao's apartment trying to keep warm after Zhang poured water on them. They explained to Zhang Hao that Zhang's door was too thick to break through so easily. Despite the unsuccessful attempt of the thugs to deal with Zhang Hao did not despair, as he was sure that sooner or later Zhang would get out of the apartment. Then Zhang Hao ordered his guys to watch Zhang around the clock and kill him as soon as he decides to open the door of his apartment. At this time, several neighbors went outside and removed all the snow that had appeared. But despite their best efforts, the snow was falling much faster than they could clear it, and without a snowplow it would be next to impossible to remove such a thick layer of snow. Zhang just looked at all this and thought that these people simply do not understand the full scale of the disaster, and that with such efforts they will not be able to avoid such a cataclysm. Later, Zhang sat down to watch the news, which told of the many victims of the disaster, numbering from 10 to 200 million people around the world. Zhang looked at all this and understood that the number of victims of such a cataclysm would only grow rapidly. At this point, Auntie Lin continued to talk about how the blizzard would end very soon and that there was no need to go to the shops and stock up on provisions now. A little later, Zhang wrote to Yuqin to find out if he was alive, but Zhang knew that now she would ask him for supplies again. Zhang decides to tease Yuqin one more time and sends her a photo of the lobster he just ate. Yuqin and her friend were shocked that instead of helping them, Zhang was only mocking them. Then Yuqin's friend writes to Zhang that he upset Yuqin very much with his act. Zhang, in turn, writes that Yuqin's mood is constantly changing, and that this does not bother him at all. Here, Yuqin's girlfriend tries to put pressure on Pity and make Zhang feel ashamed for sending them such photos, while they are both now dying of hunger. She also added that he was extremely frivolous towards Yuqin, which in turn did not affect Zhang in any way. Zhang confirmed Yuqin's friend's words that he was completely indifferent to her, which only angered her more. After such an unpleasant correspondence with Zhang, Yuqin's friend decided to find out if she had anyone else to turn to for help. Then Yuqin remembered Zhou Peng, and she immediately called him to ask him for help. A couple of hours later, Zhou Peng was already at the door of Yuqin's apartment to give them some food from the store. Yuqin was a little scared that Zhou Peng loved her so much, since he went out of the house in such a cold especially for her and even went to the store to buy supplies for them. After 3 days, electricity abruptly ended in all apartments, which once again indicated that this cataclysm would take place in the same way as the one during which Zhang died. The inhabitants of the house are in a panic, many have run out of supplies, and they began to think that they need to urgently prepare supplies. At this time, Zhang thought that in this situation, the management company would not help them in any way. After a few minutes, Zhang took out a couple of generators and turned them on so that he had at least some source of electricity, after which light came on in his apartment. Meanwhile, Auntie Lin, hiding in a blanket with her grandson, did not stop thinking that literally a few days ago in their world everything and everyone was in order. Auntie Lin noticed in the public chat how people began to talk about a set of supplies, and she decided that she needed to stock up on everything she needed before the general panic began among the residents. Then Auntie Lin wrote in the general chat that the problems were only temporary and that everyone should cooperate with the management company or the residents would be transferred to the police. People did not begin to pay attention to the appeal of some old woman, since this does not change their difficult situation in any way. Meanwhile, Zheng Hao was reading all these messages and did not understand how this old woman could command them like that in such a situation. Zheng Hao's thugs only complained that they had run out of medicine supplies and that they couldn't get out of here, to which Zheng Hao only yelled at his subordinates, calling them useless garbage. Meanwhile, Zhang was still spending his time playing games, and at one point someone wrote to him. It was Auntie Lin, and she wrote that since all the residents were in such an unpleasant situation, everyone, including him, should send all their supplies to the management company, which in turn would divide all the supplies of the residents equally. Before Zhang had finished reading the messages, almost immediately he received a couple of new private messages from Auntie Lin. In these messages, Auntie Lin asked Zhang to share with all the supplies that he recently bought whole carts. Zhang remembered the last time he was also asked to help with supplies, and that time he shared, which led to his death. Then he told her to share those supplies that she would collect, because she was one of the causes of his death. Auntie Lin was only more annoyed that a person in charge of the warehouse like Zhang couldn't share the supplies. Then she threatened Zhang that in this situation he was going against the orders of the managing organization. Zhang only said that he really didn't have enough supplies right now, and that she couldn't share her supplies with him in the first place if she decided to take the initiative to share the general supplies. Such remarks angered Auntie Lin even more, and she said that if Zhang refused to cooperate with the management company, he would be severely punished. Zhang, in turn, told her that she was just an employee of the district committee, and that she could not pose any unnecessary threat to him. Auntie Lin hung up the phone and started cursing Zhang, also thinking about how she might affect him. At first, Auntie Lin wanted to set the neighbors against Zhang, but then she thought that in this case, people would understand that they could not give their supplies to everyone. Later, Zhang saw through the cameras how the neighbors voluntarily donate their supplies to Auntie Lin. Zhang thought that these people were to blame for giving their supplies to her so easily and dutifully, and that the supplies would only be used up faster, which would lead to their quick death. Meanwhile, Auntie Lin was greedily devouring all the neighbors' supplies with her grandson instead of distributing these supplies to the residents. At that moment, someone called Auntie Lin, and it turned out to be Zheng Hao. Zheng Hao told Auntie Lin that she made a good living from her neighbors' supplies. Auntie Lin tried to justify herself by saying that all the neighbors' supplies were now under the pretext of storage, after which Zheng Hao asked her to share some supplies. She said that for some reason she couldn't just go ahead and share the general supplies with everyone. Then Zheng Hao demanded to give her supplies, otherwise his thugs would break into her house and steal all the supplies from there. A few minutes later, the thugs broke into Auntie Lin's apartment and were about to take all the supplies out of her apartment. Auntie Lin tried to stop them, but at the same time, she received a hard blow to the face for deceiving all the neighbors and for trying to keep all the supplies for herself. Zhang watched all this through cameras and received incredible emotions from what was happening. Then Zhang came up with the idea to post the entry in the general chat so that everyone could see how greedy and harsh Auntie Lin turned out to be. While Auntie Lin lay on the floor, Zheng Hao and his thugs began to search the apartment for supplies. Auntie Lin begged Zheng Hao to leave some supplies for her and her grandson. Instead, Zheng Hao pushes Auntie Lin away with such force that she flies to the other side of the room and passes out. Then Aunt Lin's little grandson decides to avenge his grandmother and plunges a knife into one of the thugs. The thug immediately turns around and kicks the boy in the stomach with all his might. From such a blow, the boy flies off into the wall unconscious and with a lifeless face falls on the sofa. Auntie Lin, with tears in her eyes, tries with all her strength to bring her grandson back to consciousness, but her attempts were unsuccessful. At this moment, Zheng Hao with his thugs took out all the supplies he found from Aunt Lin's apartment and leaves the apartment. Meanwhile, the neighbors in the chat did not stop discussing what happened to Auntie Lin and her grandson, and Zhang was quite happy with this outcome. At the same time, Zhang knew that very soon all his neighbors would be overtaken by exactly the same fate as Auntie Lin. A little later, a message from Auntie Lin comes to the chat, in which she asks the neighbors to provide some drugs so that Dr. Zhou can perform an operation on her grandson. Dr. Zhou was a first-aid doctor at a local hospital who treated people, saved them during the cataclysm, and was one of the few people who treated Zhang well. At this point, Auntie Lin would not stop asking the neighbors for help with supplies, to which people responded with either ridicule or condemnation for trying to appropriate other people's supplies. Zhang was amazed at the conscientiousness of Dr. Zhou, who, even in such a difficult time, did not stop providing medical care to people. During all this time, there was so much snow that the first floors of multi-story buildings were very soon covered with a thick layer of snow. Those people who did not have time to return home and take refuge there from the cold died very quickly from such a cold. Meanwhile, Auntie Lin began to beg the neighbors to share food for her and her grandson, and one of the residents reacted to this message by offering her a couple of packs of noodles for 1,000 yuan each, to which Zhang replied that he was ready to buy noodles from her for 2,000 yuan. People in the chat began to reassure each other that winter just came a little earlier this year, and that this is not the end of the world, like some kind of zombie apocalypse. Zhang never ceased to be surprised by the naivety of people who still believe that this will all end soon. Later, Zhang decides to write this to the girl, saying that he is ready to buy these noodles from her for any price she names, thinking to himself that this money will not help anyone survive this cataclysm anyway. A little later, a single mother with a baby writes to the general chat, who told Zhang that she and the child have nothing to eat now, and that this noodles will be their salvation, to which Zhang replied that he simply offered a higher price, and that this girl she can choose who she will give the noodles to. The single mother begged the neighbors to help her because her daughter is only 9 months old and that her mother cannot feed her milk because she has not eaten anything for a long time. Zhang understood that this single mother is not as simple as it seems, because last time she also fought for her life and the life of her daughter to the last. A week and a half later, Zhang received a call again from Yuqin, who, according to Zhang's calculations, should have run out of supplies. Zhang answers a video call to tease Yuqin and her friend a bit with his supplies, and they are both shocked that Zhang still hasn't run out of supplies. Zhang told Yuqin and her friend that he had a lot of fast food at home, as he was too lazy to cook ordinary food. Zhang also wanted to show off his fireplace to them, thanks to which his house is always warm. Yuqin couldn't help herself and started calling Zhang all the nice things she knew, and at the same time she begged Zhang to let them in. Zhang, not wanting to help Yuqin in any way, tells her that in this weather it would be better for her to stay at home. Then Zhang decided not to stop bullying Yuqin and her friend, and he noticed that judging by their appearance, they are now very cold. The fact that Zhang not only refused to help Yuqin, but also mocked them, made Yuqin very angry. Zhang then decided to remind Yuqin that her friend Zhou Peng hadn't helped her like last time. Zhang wanted to explain to Yuqin the fact that he had absolutely no obligation to help her in any way in such a situation, after which he hung up. This attitude further angered Yuqin, who never got any help from Zhang. Yuqin's friends said that they were not able to immediately understand Zhang's intentions to prepare for the cataclysm, and that they now missed the opportunity to escape forever. Also, Yuqin's friend added that now Zhang is even cooler than Su Hao, because now his money will not help in any way in such a situation. With those words, Yuqin rushed at her friend, causing them to fight each other. At that time, Zhang was watching the news that the authorities would now provide electricity for only 1 hour a day so that people could charge their phones, put on kettles and use other small household appliances. Zhang understood that the situation was becoming so critical that even on TV they did not hide it. After watching the news, Zhang decides to see what the neighbors are saying in the general chat, and when he entered it, he saw how people did not stop offering their noodles for fabulous money. Zhang was both frightened and amused by the fact that despite the seriousness of the current situation in the world, people do not stop trying to teach benefits in the form of money, which will very soon become nothing. After the fight, Yuqin and his girlfriend began to think about who else they could turn to for help. Then Yuqin decides to break into Zhang's apartment by any means, and she decides to seek help from Zhou Peng. An hour later, Zhou Peng was already at Yuqin's apartment, where she told him that Zhang had deliberately humiliated her and teased her with his supplies. Zhou Ping said that he would do everything in his power to make Zhang feel very sorry for bullying Yu Qin like that. Yu Qin tells Zhou Ping that if they can get rid of Zhang, they can move into his apartment, which is full of supplies. Zhou Ping then went with Yu Qin and her friend to Zhang's apartment to kill him. After a couple of minutes, they took out a club with a pair of cleavers and prepared to wait for the moment when Zhang left the apartment. Zhang noticed that Zhou Ping came to him, and he understood that he came to him with clearly bad intentions. Looking closer, Zhang noticed that he came to him with Yu Qin and her friend with melee weapons to kill him and take his supplies. Then Zhang decides to douse them with cold water in the same way as those thugs who recently came to him. However, Zhang remembered that he had a whole bucket of waste, which he decided to use against the intruders. Meanwhile, Zhou Peng was telling Zhang that he had run out of supplies at home and that he decided to ask Zhang for some supplies. Zhou Peng thought that now Zhang would open the door and they would have a chance to end him. But contrary to Zhou Peng's expectations, Zhang did not come out, and a pile of rotten waste flew into their faces. Then Zhou Peng began to threaten Zhang that he would kill him, while the girls became sick from the waste. Here Zhang said that these were the supplies that he wanted to give them, and that they should be grateful to him for such mercy. Then Zhou Peng decides to get into Zhang's apartment on his own, from which he receives a very powerful electric shock to his arm. From such pain, Zhou Peng immediately fell to the floor, which greatly amused Zhang. After that, Zhang leans back on the sofa with the thought that he can never leave the apartment again in his entire life, and that he can just watch what is happening without any fear. The next morning, Zhang wakes up to very loud sounds, reminiscent of gunshots, and he decides to find out what is happening in the house. Then Zhang decides to look through the security cameras to see what exactly happened in the house. When Zhang took the tablet, he saw the neighbors collecting snow from the street to melt it and use it as water. Zhang lay in bed and thought that the residents on the third floor were doomed, since most of the residents on this floor had run out of supplies. Meanwhile, Zhenghao sends a couple of photos to the general chat, one of which shows the corpses of a young couple he killed in their own apartment. Zhang was somewhat surprised by Zhenghao's determination, which once again proved that he could afford a good life even in such conditions. However, Zhang also understood that Zhenghao had a very limited amount of ammunition, and he would not be able to shoot all the residents. At that moment, a new chat appeared on Zhang's phone, in which the neighbors all together discussed the plan of resistance against Zhenghao. At one point, Uncle Yu wrote that if they did not join forces against Zhenghao, then he would simply kill all the neighbors, and he offered to take all supplies from Zhenghao. Uncle Yu offers to take all the initiative and lead volunteers to help him defeat Zhenghao. Many supported the idea of Uncle Yu, and they began to offer him various assistance in the form of providing melee weapons and developing a further plan of action. But despite such a noble attempt to get rid of Zhenghao, there were those who considered this idea another scam, remembering Auntie Lin's recent supply scam. A very large-scale quarrel formed in the new chat, in which they began to indiscriminately blame each other for everything. Meanwhile, Zhang read all these messages and understood that any other reaction of the inhabitants was not to be expected. While eating, Zhang kept thinking that absolutely all the people who blame each other in this chat for no good reason deserve to die. Meanwhile, Zhenghao and his thugs continued to kill their neighbors in order to take all their supplies from them. During the robbery, one of Zhenghao's subordinates complains about not being very tired and offers Zhenghao a bite to eat some of the supplies he received. Then Zhenghao points the barrel at the subordinate and threatens him with serious reprisals if he continues to whine. The subordinate stopped complaining and continued to dump the corpses of his neighbors into one pile. At that moment, Zhenghao thought about what they would have done to him if he did not have a gun, and if they would have obeyed him at all. Zhang watched Zhenghao's actions and understood that he deliberately left all the corpses in one place in case there were no supplies left at all, and then he would have to eat these very corpses. Zhang also thought that if Zhenghao decides to poke his head into his apartment, then this time he will simply kill him with all the thugs. The next day, one of the residents tried to call her neighbors for help to help her escape from Zhenghao. However, despite her best efforts, Zhang Hao's men still managed to break through the inner barricade of the apartment and break into it. After that, one of the subordinates grabbed the girl by the legs and dragged her out of the apartment, while her neighbors did not stop saying that this girl deserved such a fate. Meanwhile, Yu Qin and his girlfriend were thinking that if Zhang Hao's people started robbing and killing women, they would soon get to them. Then Yu Qin decides to inform some people that Zhang has supplies to try to break into his apartment with them. A little later, Zhang is added back to a new chat created by Yu Qin asking for Zhang's help. Zhang immediately realized that Yu Qin had already blurted everything out, but at the same time she forgot to clarify that it was he who was able to injure Zhang Hao. Later, Zhang sent a message to this chat, saying that he was fine alone, and that if he got bored alone in his apartment, he would definitely report it. In response, the chat members began to write about how selfish Zhang is acting, while one psycho breaks into other people's apartments and takes all the supplies, to which Zhang replies that in this case, each person's life depends on his personal abilities, after which he leaves the chat. They were extremely dissatisfied with the fact that Zhang was acting like the last egoist, despite the fact that they had all known each other for a long time. Then they decide to stop trying to negotiate with Zhang in an amicable way and move on to attacking Zhang. One of the guys says that he used to work for a company that specializes in picking locks of any complexity, and he decides to break the lock into Zhang's apartment, after which they will all get rid of him together. After a couple of minutes, they all waited together for this guy to pick Zhang's lock while the others prepared to attack. The girls also held umbrellas in case Zhang decided to spray them with cold water again. Zhang noticed how they were trying to pick his lock, and then he activates the supply of high voltage to the door. After activating the security mechanism in the door, the guy who tried to break into Zhang's door receives a very strong electric shock, from which he falls to the floor unconscious. The electric shock turned out to be so powerful that the guy's hands simply came off when he tried to pull them out. The guys started shouting towards Zhang with condemnation and contempt because they just wanted to peacefully discuss everything with him, and he just takes and kills them. Zhang took out his crossbow and prepared to defend himself so that none of them could keep trying to break into his house. A second later, an arrow shot out of Zhang's door at one of Yu Qin's companions. Such a shot went through his shoulder, and the guys decide to stop their attempts to break in and go back to Yu Qin. But after a few seconds, Zhang fired a couple more shots that wounded a couple more guys. After a couple of minutes, everyone was at Yu Qin's apartment, where one girl was trying to pull the arrows out of the guys. When trying to draw the arrows, the girl noticed that Zhang had deliberately used rusty arrows so that they could not pull them out. The guys thought that without medicine, rusty arrows could bring an infection from which they could die. Then everyone began to blame Yu Qin for not warning anyone that Zhang had a crossbow and that he could fight back. Yu Qin said that she herself did not know that Zhang could have a crossbow, since when he had her last time, he did not have any crossbow. Yu Qin's friend tried to explain to everyone that Yu Qin really didn't know that Zhang was armed. Then the girls decide to seek help from Dr. Zhou, and after a few minutes she was with them. Dr. Zhou notices that she is again trying to help a patient who was hit by an arrow, and the girls think that Zhang has already shot someone with a crossbow in this house. Dr. Zhou reassured the girls and told them that they already had such patients in the hospital. Later, Dr. Zhou tells the girls that without special medical equipment, she won't be able to help the boys. Dr. Zhou also added that without medication and antibiotics, she would not be able to simply pick up and pull out the arrow. Dr. Zhou said that she had seen similar injuries on one of the residents before, and she believed that it was definitely Zhang's handiwork. Yu Qin interrupted Dr. Zhou and said that she herself saw how, before the cataclysm, Zhang received a very large batch of medicines that could help them. Yu Qin told how, a month before the cataclysm, Zhang was shopping for various supplies almost every day, such as food, water, medicine, and other useful items. Dr. Zhou suggested that Zhang knew about the impending danger, and that he must have a lot of supplies, which probably included antibiotics. Then the guys suggested that they need to ask Zhang for help as soon as possible, completely forgetting who exactly had almost killed them with these arrows. At first, everyone doubted the reliability of such a plan, but Yuqin said that they would not try to harm Zhang, and would even be ready to share their supplies with him. Yuqin added that this time they would try to reach out to Zhang with kindness, so that he would understand that they were not his enemies and that he had nothing to fear. Then everyone suggests that Yuqin herself turn to Zhang for help, since it was because of her that they ended up in this difficult situation, and it was with her that Zhang used to communicate most often. One of the guys told Yuqin that they would all die soon if they didn't work together. Yuqin then decides to try calling Zhang to try and convince him to lend her some medicine. Calling, Yuqin said that one of her friends was already dead, and the rest were trying their best to stay alive. Zhang then asks Yuqin if they can survive such severe weather. For all the time since the beginning of the cataclysm, snowfall has been able to block all entrances to the city, making it a kind of island. At this point, many have already run out of supplies, and even if they do not die from the cold, due to lack of food, they will still die soon anyway. Yuqin, without ceasing to cry, began to ask Zhang's forgiveness, promising to correct herself and not to do this again. She once again reminded them that if they didn't take some action, they would all die, and promised that if he gave them some medicine, she wouldn't bother him anymore. At that time, one of her friends simply took Yuqin's phone and told Zhang that everyone was in a hopeless situation right now, and she asked him to put aside his insensitivity and finally help them. Zhang refuted her words about being so insensitive and said that he used rusty arrows and did not kill them just so that he could see all their fear on their faces. Such statements frightened her very much, and she felt that Zhang had completely lost his mind. After that, Zhang allowed Yuqin to come to his house for supplies on the condition that she come alone. Yuqin was overjoyed that for the first time in all this time, Zhang would finally let her in, and she promised Zhang that she would do whatever Zhang told her to. When Zhang allowed Yuqin to come to him, her friend also began to ask him to let her come to him. Yuqin then immediately ran towards Zhang's apartment while her friend tried to stop her. In parallel with this, Yuqin tried to break away from her friend, saying that she was tired of living in such conditions. Then her friend slapped Yuqin in the face and began to dissuade her from doing so, and Zhou Peng did not understand how Yuqin could ask him so easily after all that he had done for her. Yuqin replied to Zhou Peng that it was not strange that she finally had the opportunity to avoid a harsh death. After that, Yuqin approached Zhou Peng and told him that he was a good person and that he should let her go if he wished her well. Yuqin also added that she is very grateful to him for taking care of her and helping her with all his might, but he cannot give her as much as Zhang can offer, which upset Zhou Peng very much. Yuqin's friend kept stopping her, to which Yuqin Li said that she should go. Then, everyone else began to speak extremely harshly about Yuqin's selfishness, causing her to shed tears. Dr. Zhou told everyone to stop fighting because the first thing they need to think about is how they can get medicine. Then one of the guys remembered that Zhang had a fireplace, fuel and a bunch of various supplies. And because they can't handle Zhang on their own, then they can tell about his supplies to the rest of the neighbors, hoping that they will also want to try to break through to Zhang, after which they can share the supplies equally. Yuqin was categorically against such a plan, because she just wants to live with Zhang, and they want to kill him and steal his supplies. One of the friends wanted to shut up Yuqin and hit her again, but Zhou Peng stood up to protect her and protect her interests. Zhou Peng said that if he did his best, Yuqin would sooner or later also fall in love with him. This friend decided not to argue with Zhou Peng once again and decides to proceed with the implementation of the previously proposed plan. A few minutes later, this girl posted photos of the food that Zhang sent them to the general chat, so that the neighbors would understand that he now has a lot of supplies. When Zhang Hao saw these photos, he decided that it was time to take revenge on Zhang for everything he had done to him. People began to massively ask Zhang for help in the general chat, hoping that he would still help them at such a moment, and Su Hao even promised to give him all the shares of his company if Zhang shared with him. Zhang had not forgotten how in a past life he shared with all the supplies, and when he asked everyone to share the supplies, they just killed him and tore him into small pieces. Then people realized that the plan did not work, and that Zhang was not going to share supplies with anyone. Neighbors started insulting Zhang en masse for his indifference, calling him a freak and threatening him with retaliatory violence. The general anger of the neighbors at Zhang only grew, but he did not pay attention to all the negativity that was directed at him. Zhang got up from the sofa, looked out the window and thought that he was a little tired of sitting at home. Then he remembers that he also has a pair of snowmobiles with which he can safely leave the apartment and have fun on the street. At that moment, Dr. Zhou wrote to Zhang, who writes directly and without further ado that she has run out of food and medicine. Zhang remembered that the last time Dr. Zhou died because she gave her supplies to the needy, and despite such a harsh and cold appearance, she showed her best side during the cataclysm, unlike the rest of the inhabitants. Zhang thinks to help her first, but then he thinks about the fact that the smarter a woman is, the easier it will be for her to betray someone. Zhang then writes to Dr. Zhou that he can give her some of his supplies if she gives him something useful. Dr. Zhou asks Zhang for supplies as an advance since she has nothing left. Zhang then offers Dr. Zhou to get some of his supplies if he fulfills her request. Zhang will give her supplies if she reports to him about all the actions of the neighbors. Zhang offered Dr. Zhou two options: betray the residents and become his ally, or join the crowd and try to finish him off. Dr. Zhou decides to join Zhang and report to him about everything that the neighbors are going to do, which greatly pleased Zhang himself. Zhang tells Dr. Zhou to come to him for an exchange when she has any useful data. At this time, Zhang received a message in which one of Yuqin's friends kept asking for supplies. In response, Zhang only replied that even if all the neighbors wanted to burn down his apartment, no one would get his supplies. After such a rude refusal, this guy creates a new group chat in which he was going to discuss with all the neighbors a further plan to take over Zhang's apartment. Zheng Hao says that he is ready to help his neighbors on the condition that they forget all the murders he and his thugs previously committed, and that he will take half of all the supplies they find in Zhang's apartment for himself. Uncle Yu and Dr. Zhou were not happy with what they read, and they decide to report everything to Zhang. Dr. Zhou told Zhang about everything, but he already knew everything and prepared to defend his apartment, taking out all his arsenal of weapons that he only has. Zhang also warned Dr. Zhou not to visit him with the rest of the neighbors. In the meantime, many of the neighbors went to Zhang's apartment, taking with them various bladed weapons such as knives, cleavers, steel pipes, and aluminum clubs. Some of them hit Zhang's door with all their strength, their efforts were in vain, and the door still did not give in to their blows. Zhang watched as the residents tried to break through his door, and he decided to release an electric charge on the door. After one of the blows, the electric current hit so hard that it hit not only the one who hit the door, but also the people standing nearby. Such a sight greatly frightened the rest of the inhabitants, and none of them understood how they could break through such a door. One of the neighbors suggested that all the other residents should take revenge because Zhang had killed several innocent people. Then people decided to use wooden objects so that no one would be electrocuted during a ramming. Several men picked up a large wooden log and proceeded to smash the door to Zhang's apartment. At this time, Zhang was not at all worried that these people would be able to somehow damage his door. Instead of taking any action to stop the neighbors, Zhang decides to drink a glass of cognac and listen to loud music. The neighbors still did not stop ramming the door and shouting that Zhang would pay for the death of those whom he had turned on the current. After a few minutes, the neighbors got very tired and stopped trying to break through the door. One of the neighbors decided to look at the door and tells the neighbors that such a door is usually used in bank safes. He said that such a door cannot be broken even with the help of explosives, and even more so it is impossible to break through with an ordinary wooden log. At that moment, Zhang was ready to shoot the man with his crossbow. A moment later, an arrow from a crossbow shot through the throat of this neighbor, from which the neighbors concluded that Zhang had a weapon. The residents became very frightened and ran away from Zhang's apartment. Zhang continued to kill his neighbors with accurate hits, which only more intimidated the inhabitants. After several shots, several people who were shot through and through remained in the corridor, who no longer had any chance of further survival. Then the tenants thought that it was useless to try to break through the door, and they decided to try to break through the wall itself. Several people started pounding on the walls with all their might, hoping to successfully break into Zhang's apartment. However, after a few minutes, in an attempt to break through the wall, the residents noticed that the walls were also made of the same steel as the door. Despite this, people continued to try to break into Zhang's apartment with various tools. Zhang tells his neighbors that his walls are sheathed in a 20 cm wide heavy-duty alloy that can't pierce anything.